Okay, considering that Lewis was up here in a motocross onesie, I thought I would start with a joke. And it's another lawyer joke, because we seem to be enjoying those. I have it here just in case I forget it. What's the difference between a jellyfish and a lawyer? One's a spineless, poisonous blob, and the other is a form of sea life. I've got one more that's actually really funny as well. What's the difference between a lawyer and a trampoline? Well, before you jump on a trampoline, you take your shoes off. Okay, apologies to all the lawyers watching online. And yeah, so now please welcome Nick and Laura Perlas, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, pretty good.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, before we continue, I'd like to ask a lawyer. You're a lawyer, right? You? Oh.
I do have some legal training, but I'm not a practicing solicitor. No.
Okay. I was just wondering how
I certainly am not a fan.
Okay, great. Yeah. I think, okay, please. Jack? John? John? Yeah. There were a number of people who came after that and had some things he wanted to say, or comments, and then, please, John. Maybe you can come over so you're near the mic.
After his session, and I was struck by what he said about the EEG.
Yeah, please.
And I just wanted to add my experience to that because, well, we like to think of scientific evidence as being how many examples can we actually have. I had the good fortune when I was 31 to have a serious brain injury. It was really
good
helpful
fortune.
to my development. No, I mean that very seriously. I recommend them. Well, within reason. But I had an EEG during this time, and at the time I'd been working at meditation for a while. I'm not a good meditant, but I was working very hard at the process where Rudolf Steiner talks about the transition between imaginative consciousness and inspirational consciousness, essentially, where you're able to build and live in a world of living pictures, and then you erase them and live in the nothingness, and become aware of what may come towards you. Buddha describes a similar thing in the emptied consciousness stage. So I thought, EEG, wonderful opportunity. So they said, you have to stay awake during this while we read all these brainwaves. And I was sitting in another room reading it. And they kept saying to me, don't go to sleep, you're going to sleep. And I said, no, no. And I wasn't. What I was doing was trying to do this meditation. But what it did was alter the brainwave state, that it resembled sleep. And which is something that Rudolf Steiner said is that outwardly the state of inspiration resembles sleep. So I just wanted to add that story.
And you missed the important part.
Oh,
what did your medical doctors think of it?
Oh, they kept thinking that I was falling asleep.
Right.
Yeah, and they kept wanting to wake me up. I knew I was fully awake throughout this.
Right.
So it was a very useful, for me, a useful confirmation of what I was doing was actually having an effect in my physiology, and a confirmation of the path which I was following.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so you can see that our consciousness is more complicated because there's one part of it that's non-material, there's another part that's material. This is where all the confusion arises. Because even if Steiner, for example, speaks about living thinking that's not done in the brain, and somehow when you have thoughts, it's in the brain, right? I mean, the finished product then enters into physical manifestation. It's still a huge mystery on the other side, right? Because the hard problem of consciousness is from the physical side. How does non-living matter produce thoughts? And on the other side, how does spiritual activity produce impact physical stuff. It's actually a problem from both sides. And in this context, Steiner mentioned something very interesting, which I will touch on tomorrow. From the spiritual side, what is it that allows us to imprint consciousness in matter? Because this is a very, of course, as you can see, it's still a huge debate until today between brain scientists and philosophers and so on. But it'd just be interesting to consider it. And for me, it made it clearer why we have AI. Yeah. And it's up to us whether that AI can be beneficial for humanity or can bring about tremendous damage, right? It's up to us. Anyway, okay, there was another person. Oh, yeah, please. It was a very interesting break. Yeah, please.
Well, I asked Nicanor this question. So there's a person called Robert Keegan and Lay, L-A-E-Y, his partner in this, and they've written a book called Immunity to Change. And so he's pointing out that often we have an intention, we have a, even a commitment to doing something, and yet it appears that when faced with so we'll do a lot of work to get there. I was using the example of someone who is a musician that I know who has had a long commitment to becoming a musician, and yet when it comes time to do the steps of ringing up or trying to get work here and do things like that, it doesn't happen. And so, I'm not ready yet, I'm not good enough yet, I'm not this, I need to do more of this and that. So I wondered if, and so then what he said is, it's something's going on deep down, which he calls an immunity to change, which is a competing commitment with the first. So one might imagine that there could be a competing commitment to safety or security, and it's so powerful, this commitment, that it impacts. But the immunity picture is particularly interesting because he's suggesting that that's what keeps this person safe, by having this commitment. So it's an immunity in the sense that somewhere deep in the unconscious, subconscious. So I had a question. So this view of we are just material matter, we are machines, we appear not to be able to see, and is that something to do with the immunity to change?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so instead of responding to that, I'll just leave that there for reflection. So that you can think more clearly or closely about that kind of phenomena. In fact, I'm actually going to deal with that in my Sydney workshop this weekend. It's called Courage Workshop, because that's exactly the point. We get to know all kinds of things, right? And then we have to do something in the world, and then we don't act out of it. We have to understand why. So, so people can think why that is the case. Okay, so what I'm going to tackle now is what I said I was going to tackle at this time. Basically, what is life? Because to understand AI, and then, but by the way, tomorrow we'll take a look what does the universe say about all of these things, the development of the universe. To answer the AI question, we have to actually take a look at the whole picture of natural evolution as it is understood by mainstream scientists. So I'm just focusing here now. This is closer to us, life. Yesterday was consciousness. Today it's life, and tomorrow it will be the universe, where we try to bring in all of these weaves together, because natural evolution basically is telling us universal evolution. The evolution of the universe is telling us something about the universe itself as well as the human being. And for me, this is anyway, I don't want to go to the topic tomorrow. Okay, so just a few quick contextualizing comments is that statisticians, if you say the probability of something by chance, okay, because the whole natural evolution is always premised on chance. There are no external factors in the universe that are at work. Everything is in the kind of the forces active in matter. And so everything has to be explained by chance, including the emergence of life. Now, according to statisticians, mathematicians, if something is like that, the chance is 10 to the minus 50. Yeah. So in other words, what it means is that, I read this there, right? But the chance is like that, 1 in 1 followed by 50 zeros, right? That's what chance is. It's negative. So therefore, 1 over 10 to the 50. So that's 1 in 1 followed by 50 zeros, right? In other words, that's the limit of saying something, that something got caused by chance. Figures beyond that, statisticians, mathematicians will say, look for another explanation. Okay? So I just want to put that there because we'll encounter some figures that are way beyond that. Okay, so for example, we know that protein is made up of amino acids, right? That's the whole DNA thing. So the DNA sequence is really producing amino acids that become the building blocks for proteins, right? That's the thing. Now, if things happen by chance, and there was just jumble, because in the beginning there was no life, and life is supposed to produce amino acids, or a combination, what is the probability? The probability is, they've calculated it, the mathematicians have calculated it based on existing data. It's 10 minus 40,000. So the probability is 1 in over 1 followed by 40,000 zeros. In other words, it's impossible. Okay, so I just wanted to give the context for why Francis Crick preferred, the famous Francis Crick preferred directed panspermia, life seeded from another universe. Therefore, he got rid of the problem of what is life, right? Because the question still remains, how did that life arise in that part of the universe, right? He just transferred it to another problem. Okay, done with that, so now we can focus. Okay. And another way to envision that, if it were a more complex protein structure, then you would need, to predict that, you would need a computer the size larger than the entire universe to work out the calculation. So another impossible thing, right? So what is the odd? What are the probabilities from non-life for a bacterium, one single bacteria, to arise by chance? The figures that they've come out is, okay, 1 in 1 followed by 100 billion zeros. Okay, so the acceptable limit is 10 to the minus 50, right? This is 100 billion. So some scientists commented, it might be better to believe that there's a junkyard and there's a super tornado that passed through the junkyard and the 747 jumbo jet was produced. Okay, that's the way they were trying, because these figures are so large, they had to create. Huh?
It wasn't the thing that there's more likelihood of a tornado forming a 747 out of a junkyard than that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That's how the probability works out. And so that's why basically the project of trying to discover life from non-life. So it seems that we're pointing that life is something else, right? And this is a famous question because science until today has not answered this, right? Okay, now that's very big. There's another figure. From that bacteria evolving to us humans, so the stages of life, then consciousness, and then reflective consciousness. The probability is 10 to 1 followed by 24 million zeros. So basically, if you take a look, okay, these are people who have been concerned about this thing. And that's why they had to do these complicated calculations, just to see if chance is at work. Okay, so obviously it is way beyond the boundary of chance producing life. There is another principle involved. Okay, and this is what scientists are trying to figure out now, what that could be. Right? Now, I'm going to give a quote here of a Nobel Prize winner working on this area. Okay, there's some French speakers here. How do you pronounce D-U-V-E? Devu? D-U-V-E. D. Devu. D-U? Devu. Okay, however you pronounce his name. Okay. Christian Devu? No, Duve. Duve. Okay, Christian Duve. Okay, organic chemist who has been involved with this question of how life emerges from non-life by chance. And this is what he says. Okay. If you equate the probability of the birth of a bacterial cell to chance assembly of its atoms, eternity will not suffice to produce one. Okay. If you equate the probability of the birth of a bacterial cell, to chance assembly of its atoms, eternity will not suffice to produce one. Okay, even if you have eternity, I mean, I'm giving you already the mathematical improbabilities. Okay, faced with this enormous sum of lucky draws behind the success of the evolutionary game, he understands, of course, the implications to this, to a certain kind of evolutionary theory, right? One may legitimately wonder to what extent this success is actually written in the fabric of the universe. Okay, so he's becoming cryptic there, right? So he says this thing is written to the fabric of the universe. In other words, say, we'll take a look at it tomorrow, what it means. Just think about what that might mean. Because, by the way, the universe is full of similar stuff. Okay? So every major change is accompanied by highly improbable. The mathematicians will call it impossible. Beyond that, if things are beyond that produced by chance, there may be other factors at work. So what that fabric may be, we'll see more clearly tomorrow, because astrophysicists have actually dealt with that question. Okay, so now we have to also, I want to get a quote from Richard Lowentin, one of Richard Lowentin. I used to read a lot of his works because he's one of the major thinkings in neo-Darwinism, the current explanation of natural evolution. He's a mainstream guy. He's one of the architects of neo-Darwinism, which is very different from the Darwin, okay? Because Darwin did not yet have the benefit of genetics. So the new Darwinism has a lot to do with genetics, worked out. That's why it's called neo-Darwinism, but it's quite different. That's the prevalent model, which is also, by the way, collapsing. Okay, so, and I mean, I'll show you later why it's collapsing.
Can you write that name that you mentioned?
Richard Lewontin,
No, the name of his
Darwin,
Neo.
neo-Darwinism. New, updated Darwinism, not the Darwinism of Darwin. Okay. Who, by the way, had certain beliefs that were poo-pooed by the scientists and is now coming back. And referring to, he had some Lamarckian. Lamarck. That was his competitor, right? Lamarck. Lamarckian. As we shall see later on, Lamarck's point of view that you actually inherit something that you pick up in this life, your children inherit it, is now mainstream. But that was, in a sense, poo-pooed in the neo-Darwinian scheme because everything is controlled by the genes. Okay? We will get into this a little more deeper because there's certain belief system in biology that has actually collapsed in the 21st century. Started collapsing in the 1980s and finally it collapsed. Although there's still a truth to certain aspects of Darwinism, but just like what happened to Newton, right? Something much larger has taken its place. Okay. But it is important to understand that many of the adherents to AI are basing it on neo-Darwinistic natural evolution. So the major consequence is that if this is actually, in a sense, collapsing, so what is the worldview that now underlies AI? Okay? So this is what I mean to say, that you need to shine upon a certain discipline, what's going on with other disciplines, especially if they are the foundational disciplines of AI, right? So to hear the other view, so this is Richard Lowentin, one of the architects of neo-Darwinism, now dealing with this stuff, right? All of these improbabilities. He makes a comment, and it's up to you which one you will take, right? The comment of the Nobel Prize winner or Richard Lowentin. It's up to you. So our willingness to quote, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense, he's describing them, is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. So, okay, things that cannot be quantified are stigmatized as supernatural. Okay, and in science, that's taboo. Basically, taboo. So, we take the side of science, here's a very interesting comment, in spite of its patent absurdity, okay, of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, here is very clear, at least he's conscious of it, because we have a prior commitment and a commitment to materialism. Okay? So real science is about going for the truth as to where it would lead. And after this, I'm going to speak about a very famous, maybe I'll do that tomorrow because I'm going to take up time. I mean, the key point here, science, real science is following where the evidence leads, not to any prior commitments about what the view of the world was. Okay? When I was younger, I totally questioned all spirituality because I had a scientific training. I wanted this to be solid. I rejected anything spiritual. I almost committed suicide because of that. Because if you follow through with that thought, there's no meaning. But anyway, that's why I took up science and been following the scientific development. The key aspect of science is what is the truth, no matter what it leads to. That is real science, not an ideology. Okay? And we must understand that science was reacting. The beginnings of science was asking to, as I mentioned yesterday, to over-speculation on the side of the spirit. The Middle Ages, dealt with such philosophical questions as how many angels dance on the pin of a head, right? So Bacon was reacting to that. And so they wanted to do away with that kind of belief system and started to study how does the world really work. Okay, so this is important to see that this commitment was that science really in the beginning was not materialistic. In fact, Newton, the famous Newton, is considered by Frances Yates. Yeah, you should take a look at her book. She's a French woman, Frances Yates. She's a historian of science, and especially about the scientific revolution that brings us to today. She said that, or quoted somebody anyway, that Newton was the last alchemist. Newton discovered this laws of gravitation, not to induction. He had an interesting prior belief system of alchemy, where he said this must actually quite exist in the world, so he actually discovered the laws of gravity based on his alchemical worldview. Wow. No, this is true for many scientists. So what I'm saying is that even Darwin still had a kind of remnants of some belief in a higher power. I must mention this because science itself, if done properly, is awesome. Okay? It is very important for human civilization. That's why it's important that it remains objective and it's in constant search for the truth. Yeah, and you just go where the evidence leads. Yeah. Now, by the way, I'm saying this because if tomorrow something is shown to be something, I will give up my worldview, right? I have no problems discarding my worldview. But as Thomas Kuhn, I talked to you about Thomas Kuhn, right? The structure of scientific revolutions, and this begins to answer your question. It is natural for people to resist immunity to change if they spent their whole career defending a system, and all of a sudden that's slowly being overturned, and they stick to it until they die. It's nothing to do with scientific procedure, but their refusal because of all the implications. When you have a certain worldview, of course, it connects to how you deal with reality. So it's very complicated. You're not just giving up a belief system. That belief system is the governing framework for how you will deal with the world. So you just don't give it up easily. Which is also good, because you want to make sure before you give up something, there's something solid that you are actually accepting, right? So that is that's why I was just kind of reading this thing. And just to continue, I mean, because that's the, look at this. We take the side of science. I'm just saying that this is not science in its original conception. And the switch to materialism was not necessarily part of science. It was a decision, which happened in the 19th century. This non-material stuff is too complicated. Let's just focus on the material. So a methodological switch became a worldview. So from methodological materialism, it's a method of just narrowing our focus. It became a belief system. And now it's running up into all sorts of, we said, anomalies. So Richard Lowentin, in the face of these anomalies, is saying, we take the side of science, a very narrow view of science, in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs. The apparent absurdities now, look at the figures, it's impossible for life to emerge from non-life, but yet they continue to believe in that is the situation, right? In spite of the failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises and of health and life, in spite of the intolerance of scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment to materialism. I mean, I respect this guy, right? Because he's very clear as to where his thought system is coming from. Yeah. But it's also good for you if you're going to try to figure out materialism. You are actually, in a sense, there's a lot of belief aspects in materialism that may not be scientific. I mean, it's your choice. Yeah? I mean, life from non-life. They've been at this since 1949, trying to create life in the laboratory under natural evolutionary context. If this is how it arose, maybe this is how it was created, so they tried to create those conditions. So Francis Crick gave up, right? He preferred to have a undetectable spaceman or a pan-directed panspermia. Life came from another place. It's too complicated to figure out the science of that. Okay, now he says, it is not the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. So now he's actually aware that science by itself is a methodology. It's not a worldview. It's an approach. Yeah? But on the contrary, that we are forced by a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. And then he says, moreover, that materialism is absolute. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Okay, it's as clear as that. And that's why you have books like The Selfish Gene. In The Selfish Gene by Dawkins, right? You're familiar with that. It's a very famous book, which is based on this. Richard Dawkins. He draws out the implications of neo-Darwinism for what humans are. He wrote the book Selfish Genes. And in the end, he says, there's actually no individual. There's no human being. I mean, in essence, because what we are as human beings, we're just carrying DNA encoded. This DNA finds our organism as a way to replicate into the future. There's basically no meaning. It's us that we are just basically, we're the parasitic host for our DNA, the DNA that's being transmitted through us. That's how the DNA lives. So you begin to see when this is thought out, it produces things like that, right? Okay. So let's go to some details. This is just kind of an introduction, right? About probabilities of chance, non-chance, and all of that, if you want to be scientific about it, right? So, and the reason why I'm quoting people who've done work on this area and have been awarded is because you begin to see the quality of scientific work, okay? And there are cracks in the scientific establishment, and that crack is getting bigger, okay? When I say crack, in the materialism of science is getting out. That's why the book that I referred to by Sheldrake, Science Set Free, it's actually setting free from all these self-imposed constraints around the scientific method. The self-limitation of what science can be. There's no possibility for science of the spirit, although you can have an objective relationship to your inner content of your consciousness in much the same way that you can have an objective relationship to nature. That's taboo. Because science, some scientists have decided to just investigate matter and then evolve everything out of that. Okay. So, we've heard about the Human Genome Project. How many have heard about the Human Genome Project? Okay, good. Yeah, big thing because, you know, when it was finished, Clinton and who was the Prime Minister of England? Blair. And then Francis Collins of the government side and Craig Venter of the business side, who were both doing the sequencing the human genome. All four of them, when it was all finished, made an announcement to the world, right? And it was headline news all over the world. What's that, 2000, 2001? $10 billion for the Human Genome Project. I don't know how much it cost on the private side. That was an amazing achievement. It was a dream for biologists, but it was at the same time the beginning of the end of conventional biology. It's really bizarre, right? You spend 10 years decoding something, hoping to finally find the DNA structure that will explain how we behave. That's what it is if you're determined. The determining factor is the structure of your DNA, because it will be the genotype of your behavior if you insist on a materialistic explanation, right? That's why in the US, when I was there, I just can't help but laugh. Okay, if you're voting Republicans because your genetic sequence has predisposed you to be Republican. I mean, that's the implication, right? And so, I mean, they're just trying to be very consistent. So they thought that by sequencing the human genome, they'll find all kinds of things that are connected to behavior, phenotypes, how you appear, your behavior, and so on, the color of your eyes, and what kind of illness will you have, all of this. And while this was going on, billions of dollars were being invested in the biotech corporation. So finally, we will have the map of life. We will know how to use that map to make life better. After this discovery, the whole biotech investment basically almost collapsed, except for Monsanto and a few others. Because what did they find out in the Human Genome Project? They had a theory that we had 120,000 genes or something there, right? Because in the thinking of the biologists who did this, there's a certain gene for a specific trait. So that gene must explain the trait, right? Yeah. Then there's a complex of genes. If you want to explain nitrogen fixation in legumes, you have a cluster of 23 genes systems that are working together to produce nitrogen. So they were just trying to figure it out. And it turned out that the human genome had only 23,000 genes. So what happened to, so not only that, they also subsequently discovered that one gene segment, depending on its environment, okay, and this is the reason why this whole thing sort of started crumbling, the structure, depending on its environment, will have 30,000 possibilities of expression. So that was the end of the belief that one gene, one is a certain trait, right? Or a cluster. But that the same genetic segments would have 30,000 possible expressions. Where did that come from? So that's how the whole thing, this is more complicated than we thought. And it gave rise to epigenetic biology. Yeah?
I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. So
yeah.
They thought that one gene would have one trait. And
yeah.
In fact, one gene can do 30,000 different things.
Right. Okay. So in other words, the technical language is one genotype is correlated to one phenotype. This is the basis of genetic engineering. So Monsanto, for example, transferred the gene from a bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis, and transferred it to corn. And the corn expressed that, but not totally faithfully. But now, so now the whole corn plant is toxic with the Bt genes. And since you're continually expressing that toxicity in the ear of the corn, the targeted pests are becoming immune to it, okay, because it's nothing like a pesticide effect. So they didn't really solve the problem. Okay, so that is one of the complications of this, that there is something. And then finally they started seeing, and this is a lot of medical implications. So the new biology, okay, so you have Darwin. Okay, maybe you use the other blackboard. So Darwin, Neo-Darwinism. Remember our chart from physics? Yeah. Neo-Darwinism. And then now, epigenetic biology. Okay. The scientific community is now, since I think in 2005, because this was becoming really obvious, that external, okay, before this was the model of how biological machines functioned, right? Okay. So the model was that this is the, okay, this, let's say this is the cell, right? And that is the nucleus. And then you have here the chromosomes, the human chromosomes, right? Now, a German biologist, scientist, by the name of Weizmann, his theory became the central dogma of biology, okay? Because he said there is a barrier. The flow of instructions from the DNA, from the genes, is one way. From the nucleus to the cell, and then to the phenotype, right? So the nucleus contains the genotype, and that barrier is since known as the Weizmann's barrier. That was used, that was incorporated into Neo-Darwinism. That's why you have the book, Selfish Gene. Everything's about the gene. We're just carriers of genes that are replicating themselves to immortality. I can see some of the look in the faces. we have to understand how these people think, right? Yeah, because, by the way, they're creating our world. Yeah. Okay, so we need to understand how they think. Oh my God, I'm not even halfway. Okay. Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you. So what they're finding out is actually, first they find out cytoplasmic factors, which means to say cell. Cellular factors are actually determining how the DNA functions. That's the first crack. And then the crack became very wide because now they're finding out all kinds of factors are coming in, influencing the genome. That's why it can have, the gene is not actually, it's not what they thought it was. It's not the DNA of life. It's just a very particular piece of matter that is like a form. You know, you build a house, you create a form. The DNA allows that, the forces that are creating it to have a kind of form. But what that form will be is not in the DNA. This is another very important thing. So, but before we go that, it's called the protein folding problem. Protein folding problem. Which, by the way, still exists. I first encountered it in 1980s. It still exists today. They haven't figured out this problem. I'll explain to you about later, but I'll just finish the thought because epigenetic biology is saying that external factors external to the nucleus is actually affecting how DNA will express itself. Okay? And then finally, they've shown that your consciousness can alter how the genome functions. Okay, so we're back with consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. That mysterious thing.
And freedom.
And freedom, yeah. That's why some people, for example, why is it that 30%, at least in the United States, of people get cured because of their belief that they will get cured? It's called the placebo effect. You know, they thought they were taking medicine, but they were not. It's just water. And then they got cured. And then there are now cases where people know that it's water, and they're still taking the thing, and they believe they will get cured. So it's getting complicated, right? Because now you have the human being with an inorganic aspect to it, a living aspect to it, a consciousness aspect to it, and also self-reflective aspect to it that can say, I'm going to intend this thing to happen in my organism. And the DNA and the other cellular processes will start responding to this. And what's the name of this guy? Forgot the name of this guy. Very, very interesting book, but his book is called The Biology of Belief. Bruce Lipton, yes. I say you know it, okay? The Biology of Belief. And he's a pioneer in epigenetics. He actually discovered the mechanism of it. He was a cytologist, an expert on cells. And he said he had some very interesting discoveries there about it totally depends on how the genome functions depending on where the cell is emerged. Okay. Okay. Shall we take a break? 5 minutes? Okay. The tape is running out. 5 more minutes, yeah. Okay. So, thank you. So, the consciousness problem is now, the consciousness is now going to determine how healthy you will be. And I have many experiences of how this thing works personally because, okay, I'll tell you one story. This will have to be quick because of the time. I'm allergic to shrimps, and I really vomit and have violent reactions. So one type, shrimps, prawns, shrimps and stuff like that, crabs. Yeah. And so one day I was flying back from Finland to the Philippines, which is like a 20-hour journey or 24 hours, a very long trip. And it was dark, so, and I had a vegetarian diet, and anyway, there were shrimps there and I ate it all up. And so I started feeling the effect, but I didn't want, it's a long flight, and it's gonna be very embarrassing if I start vomiting there with my neighbors. So I told myself, I'm gonna dissolve this shrimp. And it was very interesting, it did. There was nothing that happened to me except that I farted a lot. So in other words, it was not a complete digestion process, but it digested it. Yeah. There are many other cases that I can tell you that your consciousness can affect your health. This is very important because the way cells and genes function is no longer the way it has been taught to us in our university days. And it's really very important to stay abreast with science because you know the half-life of science. Molecular biology has the half-life of 6 months. You're a PhD in molecular biology. After 6 months, half of your knowledge is obsolete. Yeah, nuclear physics, 1 year. But those were before the massive acceleration that was in the 1990s. So it may be faster. Medicine is 2 years. That's why medical doctors in the US, including my brother, have to take examinations every 2 years to show whether they're updated with the latest development in medicine. Oh, yeah, another brother. So I think I have to come to a conclusion. And the conclusion is that what is life? Current stage of scientific knowledge, life is not in matter, neither in the genes. The genes are just instruments of life, not life instruments of the gene. This is very important because it has implications. And why did evolution produce life first before consciousness? Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah.